So here are the three fundamental economic questions that all societies have to deal with on account of scarcity. They all arise because of scarcity, correct? First question is what to produce, meaning what goods and services should a country or society produce given its scarce resources of, can somebody name the four resources?
Land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship.
Right. Land, which is all natural resources, and labor, which is all human effort in production. Capital, which in this course doesn't mean financial capital. Rather, it means physical capital, which is tools and machines, right? And then we have entrepreneurship, which is the business acumen, or the business smarts that some people possess, others are trained with, that helps them then combine land, labor, and capital in a useful, profitable way, right? Now, these are our four scarce resources, and every country has a limited quantity of these. Hence, every society has to scratch its head and try to figure out what it's going to do with these resources, what to produce. The second question then is, what methods of production should be employed? And an example here would be that there are two stark choices that we are faced with. And one is, should we make things using a lot of labor and relatively little capital? That would be a labor-intensive method of production. Or should we produce things in a capital-intensive way, which is to say, employ lots of machines and relatively less labor? That's one example of the sort of choice we have to make as regards how to produce, right? The third question is, for whom to produce, which is to say that once these goods and services that we've decided to produce have been produced, who will get to consume them, is the third question. Now, they all arise because of scarcity, correct? Because of scarce resources, the goods and services that we end up producing will be also scarce. They will be in limited quantities. Hence, we have to think about who gets to consume them, right? Because if Joe gets to consume more, then Sam will get to consume less, correct? Now here, we are going to talk about the issue of self-interest versus social interest. Remember, what we're doing here is we're touching upon a variety of topics that illustrate the special logic of economics. Self-interest and social interest. Now, is there a conflict between the two? In other words, when people act selfishly, are they necessarily harming society? Or will they necessarily hurt others by being selfish? What do you think?
No, not usually.
Now, the socialists, the communists believe that there was this conflict. In fact, they believe that if you were selfish, then you were certainly going to harm your fellow man, right? And hence they set about erecting a system where theoretically everyone was supposed to be working in the social interest. Of course, that's not how it worked. Human beings are intrinsically wired, I think, to act selfishly, right? So what is the capitalist take on this? Well, capitalism believes that there is no fundamental conflict between self-interest and social interest. If you are a businessman producing a good, you're doing so not out of social interest, but out of self-interest, correct? You want to make a lot of money. However, in order to make money, you will have to produce something that others want, that is, in fact, useful to others. Is that correct? So by acting in self-interest, you are also then acting in the social interest. Am I making sense? So if you're a dairy farmer, let's say, producing milk, then you will ensure that your milk is of high quality, that it is hygienically packed, and so on, correct? You will do all these things not because you want others to drink clean milk and be healthy. That's not your primary motive. Your motive is to make as large a profit as possible, correct? But in the pursuit of this self-interest, you are also, in a sense, acting in the social interest, correct? Is that understood? So the viewpoint of capitalism is that there is no conflict between the two, generally speaking. Now, there are occasions when there is conflict, and let me talk about that. Sometimes there can be conflict between self and social interest. For example, it says here, oil companies produce gasoline out of self-interest, and motorists buy this gas out of self-interest. But the carbon dioxide produced by the burning of fossil fuels contributes to global warming and perhaps climate change, right? So what's happening here? Who are the parties acting in self-interest here, in this example? The oil companies and the motorists, correct? They're both acting in self-interest. They're both happy here, clearly. So if society consisted only of oil companies and motorists, everything would be hunky-dory, correct? But the fact is that there are third parties out there who are being affected by the transaction between the oil companies and the motorists. And these third parties are being affected by such things as climate change. Now, this is a controversial area, I realize. Lots of people in Texas don't believe it's happening, including our last governor. But I think science is now pretty much, certain that something is happening. Yes? So how would I characterize this then? I have the seller and I have the buyer. And these guys are engaging in a voluntary transaction. Now, since the transaction is voluntary, we can assume that both are being benefited. Otherwise, why would they engage in this transaction? Am I correct? So they're both benefiting from this. But then you have a third party out there, and this third party is being affected by this transaction in a negative way in this example. Correct? So in this case, we might say that there is, in fact, a degree of conflict between self-interest and social interest. Correct? Now, this is an example of something called a negative externality. So this is an example of a negative externality, where third parties are affected negatively. So this is an example of conflict between self and social interest. And when you have this kind of conflict, there is a role for the government. The government usually must step in to mediate things, to work things out in a way that benefits society as a whole. Right? So there is grounds for government intervention when such a conflict arises because of externalities, for example. Okay? Can somebody give me another example of such an externality? Anyone? Where you have a seller and a buyer who are happy, but third parties are negatively affected?
Like dumping radiation.
Dumping radiation. Well, that's an example. Can you elaborate a little, perhaps? So who's the seller, who's the buyer?
Well, I wouldn't know who would buy that. The government, I guess, buy uranium.
Hang on, where is the radioactive waste coming from?
Power plants.
Power. So
I guess
power plants are the sellers of electricity.
Yeah.
And us consumers who buy electricity are the consumers, and we are both happy. But if the power plant is producing energy in a way that is polluting, such as in a nuclear facility, because you see the nuclear waste has to be gotten rid of at some point. But even if it were a coal-burning power plant, I think that too would be harmful to the environment. It would spew out a lot of smoke into the atmosphere. Am I correct? So the power plant then is a polluter, and you can think of this as an example of a negative externality. Correct? So let's now switch to another little topic. We're touching upon, as I said, a variety of different things here to give you a sense of what economics is about. I find it a very interesting subject. It touches upon many aspects of our lives. Okay? And the idea here is that you want to come out of this course, literate in basic economics. So what is this slide talking about? Here we are talking about the economist's view of human decision making. Okay, and what is this view? First, economists view human decisions as a step-by-step process. Okay, so the first thing is human decisions are a step-by-step process. Consider your decision to attend UTB this semester. You may consider this to be a step that you've taken. At the end of this semester, you will decide whether or not to continue for yet another semester. In other words, you will contemplate taking another step. Am I making sense? So at any point in time, you can view yourself as standing on or standing at an imaginary line. So imagine that in front of you is a line drawn on the ground. And you are standing here, and I'm going to draw your footsteps. This is where you were standing. And you are thinking of taking another step across this line. In other words, you are contemplating putting your foot here. You are thinking of doing this. Yes? How will you make this decision? According to economists, it's quite simple. This step usually involves a cost to you, and there is also some potential benefit to you. There is a cost and a benefit. Yes? When do you proceed to take this step? You proceed to take the step when the benefit exceeds the cost. Does that make sense? It's perfectly simple, perfectly logical. You take a step when the benefit from taking the step is bigger than the cost of taking the step. Now, this line on the ground in front of you has a name. We call it the margin. So you are thinking of stepping across that margin. Hence, we use the term marginal benefit and marginal cost. You follow me? So the marginal benefit to you would be the benefit from taking a step across that margin. And the marginal cost is the cost of taking a step across that margin. So when do you end up taking a step? When the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. This is when, according to economists, human beings take a step forward. On the other hand, if marginal cost is greater than marginal benefit, the step will not be taken. Can we apply this idea to all kinds of human decision making? Can we? Could we perhaps apply this to, and this may cause you to raise an eyebrow, could we apply this to the human decision to have a child? In fact, it probably still does. You see, economists believe that in the back of our minds, we're always doing these little calculations. We're trying to figure out cost and benefit. Why are you here this semester? Why did you take this step? Presumably because the benefit to you of taking this step is greater than the cost. Correct? Now I look around this class and I don't see anybody who is particularly old. You're all young people. Why is that? Why, generally speaking, do we not see gray-haired men and women on college campuses as students, that is. Let's think about that carefully. Benefit and cost. Now, they aren't here presumably because for them, for older people, the cost is bigger than the benefit. Correct? According to our logic? Why would that be? Let's consider the cost side of things. Is cost higher for older people than for younger people? Cost of attending college? Do they pay a different level of tuition? I don't think so.
Well, if they have a good job that they already have, they're going to have to give that up to go to school, give up their time.
And that is something we will talk about shortly, but I'm giving you a flavor of this already. Yes, college is more costly for older people. Why? Not because they pay a different rate of tuition or because books are more expensive for them or anything. It's nothing like that. There is one element of cost that we have to consider, and that is opportunity cost or implicit cost. Now, I'm jumping ahead of myself, but I'll talk about this in more detail shortly. But one of the costs of attending college is income that you give up by attending college. By being here in class, you're actually giving up some income. Do you agree? You might have been working somewhere out there, earning some money. Now, for an older person, because this older person has much more work experience and so on, this person's hourly wages are probably much higher than for a younger person. Correct? So when an older person takes time off work to attend college, he or she is giving up more income. And this causes her cost of attending college to be higher. Agreed? So we've established now that for older people, it's more expensive to attend college. That's one. What about the benefit side of things? So we know that cost and benefit, glass in which I'm holding my spectacles, but that's the benefit side, all right? So we've just figured out that for older people, cost is higher. What about benefits? Is that different for between a younger and an older person? How?
The benefit of us going to school now is that we're looking to get a better career.
Yes.
If you are older, you're going to graduate a degree, but it's not going to take you as far as if you're young.
What do you mean take you as far?
Well, if you're getting a degree in accounting and you're 50, you're already going towards the end of your career time anyway. You're not going to get as much use out of it.
The point being made there is, for an older person, there are fewer years left in which to enjoy the benefits. The benefit takes the form of a higher annual salary, correct? And since the older person has fewer years to retirement, there are fewer years in which the older person can benefit from attending college. Am I making sense? Right? If you're 21 or 22 when you graduate college, you've got years and years, decades of a work life ahead of you. Am I correct? On the other hand, when you're 50, the number of years of work life ahead of you is much reduced. Right? So what have we established here for an older person? Costs are higher and benefits are low. Right? And so it makes perfect sense that we don't see too many older students on college campuses anywhere in the world. Right? So is this logic making sense? And is this a sensible way of looking at human decision making? Right? We've just talked about that. And here I'm going to repeat something I just mentioned. Marginal cost has two components. Marginal cost consists of explicit cost and implicit cost. Now, what is explicit cost? Explicit cost is dollars that leave your pocket. In other words, college tuition would be an explicit cost. Am I correct? Right? In a sense, it's money leaving your, even if it's financial aid, you can think of financial aid coming to you first, and then you paying for it out of your pocket. Right? So this is money coming out of your pocket. Explicit costs consist of money coming out of your pocket. Implicit costs, on the other hand, consist of money that would have entered your pocket but now doesn't. Right? So implicit cost is money that doesn't enter your pocket. This is money that used to enter or could enter but now doesn't because of the step that you are taking. Right? And so cost consists of both. And this cost is called opportunity cost. Opportunity cost stands for the value of opportunities that you give up in order to take a step. And what you give up? Let's say you spend $5 on lunch. Well, those $5 could have been spent somewhere else. Am I correct? So you're giving up an opportunity worth $5. Now, this is entirely explicit, right? But let's say that you take lunch break, an unpaid lunch break, let's say. Right? And let's say that your hourly salary is $9 an hour. And you go for lunch for an hour, you spend $5 on lunch at McDonald's. What is your cost of lunch? What's your opportunity cost of lunch now? When you take an hour off work, an unpaid hour off work. How much? $5 paying for lunch, which is money coming out of your pocket, that would be explicit cost, plus you're giving up $9 an hour of wages. Is that correct? Because this is an unpaid hour that you're taking off, right? So that makes your lunch how expensive? $14. $14 is the opportunity cost of your lunch, right? And this $14 opportunity cost can be broken up into a $5 explicit cost and a $9 implicit cost. Yes? Now, before we proceed to this slide, let me now talk about another kind of human decision making. Having a child, which you just mentioned. Can that be an economic decision? Can we use cost and benefit, etc., to figure this out? Now, let me ask you a simple question. Your grandparents, how many siblings do they have? Can someone volunteer that information? Anyway, 10 siblings. 5, you said. Okay, your parents, how many siblings they have? 4. So that family, her family went from 10 siblings to 4 siblings. And how many siblings do you have? 9. So we went from 10 to 4 to 1. What's happening here? Why are families becoming smaller? Can we use this idea of cost and benefit to figure this out?
Yes.
Let's consider the cost side of things. Now, the reason why her parents only had 1 child is presumably because, in terms of cost and benefit, after she was born, it was more expensive. The marginal cost of having a child was bigger than the marginal benefit. Hence, they didn't take that step. Correct? Why would that be now? Why are families becoming smaller? Is the cost of having a child going up? Is the benefit going down? Let's think about this carefully. The cost of having a child, has that changed significantly? And I mean in real terms. Now, this is important. You see, we must make this distinction between real dollars and nominal dollars. When somebody tells you that back in the old days, gas was 25 cents a gallon, and today it costs these days $2 a gallon. $2 is bigger than 25 cents. Hence, gas prices have gone up. Do you agree with that statement? No, this is completely wrong. And see, this is logically economic. So at the end of this course, you won't make that logical error anymore. The reason why you can't say that $2 today is bigger than 25 cents in the past is because the two are different dollars. Today's dollar is a 2015 dollar. And the 25 cents that we were speaking of is denominated in let's say, $70. You have dates below these dollar signs. And why do I put a date there? Because money could buy a whole different quantity of goods back then. 25 cents was a lot of money. You follow me? If you were a child in 1970, maybe you got 50 cents pocket money a week. Correct? So you can't really compare the 25 cents with 2 cents. Right? So those of you who are saying, well, children are more expensive today, it costs more to get diapers and so on, well, that may not be strictly speaking true. Not in real terms. And you may say, well, I have to buy an iPod for my child. You don't have to. That's not a cost, really. That's something that you do because it gives you pleasure, it gives your child pleasure, and so on. That's not really a price tag that comes with the baby. Do you follow me? Right? So in terms of cost, I don't think much has changed. In real terms. In fact, in many ways, having children has become cheaper. Why? Because a lot of goods have in fact become cheaper, not more expensive in real terms. You follow me? If you convert the price of a car back in 1970 into today's money, it will be comparable, and it will be a much worse car. You follow me? The 1970 car was probably much less safe than today's car. The gas guzzler, and that's probably not as comfortable as today's car. Right? When you adjust for quality and so on, things have in fact become cheaper, not more expensive in real terms. So, do you get my point? So, as regards cost of children, I don't think much has changed there. And let's look at the benefits. I correct myself. I made an error myself. What is that? When I think of the cost, when I spoke of the cost of children just now, I only spoke of which kind of cost, explicit or implicit. I only talked about explicit, but there is an implicit element also. That has changed. I'm correct myself. The explicit costs haven't changed, but implicit costs may have changed. Let's think about implicit costs. What is the primary implicit cost of having a child? What is an implicit cost again? Money that now doesn't come into your pocket because you have a child. What kind of money is it? The mother has to take time off of work. Right? Now, in the old days, the mother pretty often didn't work in the first place. Right? Today's mothers very often are career women. Right? And let's consider a Wall Street lawyer who makes, say, $300,000 a year, or maybe more, Those guys make millions of bucks a year. And she takes time off work to have a child. She's out of commission for, let's say, 4 weeks. Maybe longer. Can you compute the cost now to her having that child, the implicit cost? It's enormous. And it's not just the salary she gives up. When she takes time off to have a baby, well, it can derail her career. In the time that she took off, she may have missed out on some important assignments. Right? The baby itself may now constrain her work life. She has to back home 5 and so on. Right? And so she may have been a high flyer at the beginning, Her corporate bosses probably looked at her as somebody who might, one day become CEO, or that changes if you have a child. So what is the cost to her having a child? Millions of dollars. Correct? So that's an expensive price tag, am I right? So when you think of the cost of having a child, what's changed is the explicit costs have, I think, remained about the same, maybe reduced. But the implicit costs have gone up because many more women work today. Right? And so having a child means taking time off work, building up this income. Yes? So, what's happening on the cost side? It's going up, correct? Okay. What about the benefit side? Has that changed? So what are the benefits of having children? Now let's not be hard-hearted economists here and boil everything down to money. Clearly, there are psychological benefits. All right? There are psychological benefits. But here's the question: can we convert those psychological benefits into dollar terms? Could we price those psychological benefits. How do you go about doing that? Is that possible? I derive X dollars worth of psychological benefits from having my child. Is it possible to come up with that number X? How would you do it? The idea is, well, this is how you could proceed. You could have this couple there, and you could say, well, let's say this is a couple that's intending to have a child, yes? They want to have a child. And then you sit down with them and say, well, I'm going to now start feeding, putting money on the table to prevent you from having that child. How much money would it take for me to pay you for you not to have a child? Is that an expense that you can conceive of? That's something to think of? So you start putting money down, you put down $1,000. They say no, you put down more. And at some point, they reach a figure and say, well, okay, we take that, and you're not having it. Now that stuff that they accept, could you not say that that is equal to their psychological and other benefits having a child? Yes? So the point is that you can convert those psychological benefits into money value. You could. Right? So let's look at the benefits, psychological and otherwise. What's happened to the benefit side of that story? What's changed between your grandparents' day and today? Have the psychological benefits changed? Did you say they've changed? I don't think they've changed. We humans are still the same, I think. It's still part of the animal kingdom. Like a very devout person, you might object to that statement. But the point is, we are part of the natural world, right? And so these instincts are still the same. Right? Now let's look at the non-psychological benefits. Are there other benefits to having children? Practical kind of benefits. Well, in the old days, your child could work on the family farm. Your child was labor, free labor. Correct? So there was this value, this economic value to having a child. Right? What else has changed? Well, in the old days when there was no social security, now we're talking when social security was born. Any ideas? Which president brought in social security? Any ideas? Nixon. I think it goes way before that. It goes back to FDR. Franklin Roosevelt. Now, there was a time when there was no social security. So when you were old, who looked after you? Your children looked after you, financially. Right? So your children then were a source of old age support to you. So there were all these sizable economic benefits to having children. And all of that has changed in the modern era. People don't live on family farms anymore. Right? So the free labor aspect has gone down. You might make them mow the lawn now, and then you have to pay them people. Correct? And you have you don't depend on them for old age support either, at least not financially, not so often. Correct? Now they might look after you in other ways, that still happens. Right? But the point is that costs have gone up and benefits have come down. Right? And so people are having fewer children. Does that make sense to you? So we can explain lots and lots of phenomena using this very simple logic. Marginal benefit versus marginal cost. Let me give you another example, a historical example that is interesting, I think, and also underscores this point. And here I'm going to talk about the country of Sweden. In the 1850s. And what happened in Sweden in the 1850s was that suddenly there was a sharp decline in family size, the number of children the Swedish couples were having. And demographers. And demography is the science of population. It's a social science also. And demographers have puzzled about this. Why did Swedish families suddenly become smaller in the 1850s? And here they came up with a very interesting story. And the US had something to do with it. See, what was happening then in the 1850s was a lot of lands were being settled in the US. Populations were moving westward from the East Coast, right? And they moved on to the Midwest, for instance, flat prairie lands, right? I'm going to be, that's politically incorrect here, but that's the truth. They killed off all the buffalo, killed off all the Native Americans. And they went and settled there, and this flat prairie land is very well suited to growing wheat, right? And so US output of wheat greatly increased in the 1850s. Now wheat is a good that can easily be transported to other countries. So this American wheat began to be available in Europe as well, in Sweden. And what did that do to the price of wheat in Sweden? Dropped, correct? And we're going to learn more about this in Demand and Supply Analysis, Chapter 4. But there was this big increase in the world supply of wheat. This brought down the price of wheat in Sweden. Swedish farmers began to hurt because of this, right? And they decided to make a business decision. They decided to move away from wheat into something else that would not compete with cheap American goods. And what was this item that they chose? It was dairy products. Now, America was producing a lot of dairy products also. All this prairie land that was opened up, so there were herds of cattle on it also. Back in the 1850s, impossible to ship to Europe, correct? In wooden sailing ships, you can't ship milk on a voyage lasting 2 weeks max. Am I correct? So there was no threat from cheap US dairy in Sweden. Right. So the Swedish farmer moved from wheat to dairy. Now, dairy work was traditionally work that was done by women. You see? You've all heard of the milkmaid, right? So the milking of the cows and the churning of the butter, all that was done by women. So right away then, when you have this shift from wheat to dairy, women's labor becomes more important on the Swedish farm. Right? Every Swedish housewife is now a working woman. In fact, her labor is now crucial for the farm. And what does that do to the cost of having babies now? It raises the cost of having babies. The implicit cost of having a baby rises. If you have this woman who's now out of commission because she's had a baby, well, the revenue of the farm drops because farms now depend on dairy. Right? So this is an explanation for the sharp decline in Swedish family sizes in the 1850s. A true historical example that has been explained, I think, in a very sensible and plausible way. Right? A little bit now about the way economists come up with their ideas. It says here at the bottom of the slide, an economist begins with a question or a puzzle about cause and effect arising from some observed facts. So the economist, like any human being, looks around him and says, well, this seems to be happening, and is it perhaps connected to something else? Right? We might observe oil prices falling, and we might say, well, does the increase in Saudi oil supply have anything to do with it? You can see they might ask the question. Okay. So we begin with some question. In other words, we start with a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a statement about cause and effect. So we start with a hypothesis, but then we have to set about seeing whether the hypothesis is in fact true. So the next step then is the building of a model. Economists set about elaborating on the hypothesis, developing the hypothesis, and building what is called an economic model. So an economic model is the hypothesis worked out in some detail, right? So the argument is then fleshed out in a sense, and that brings us to this model. Now, economic models in modern times tend to be fairly mathematical. As I mentioned in class on Monday, economics is the most mathematical of all the social sciences. Economists like the language of mathematics because it makes things very precise, and so on. You don't have to write in a very wordy way when you can express all of that using an equation. Now, a model is a simplification in a sense, because let's say that your hypothesis is that A affects B. Where A and B are two phenomena, and you're trying to connect them. You're saying that A affects B. That's what you've hypothesized. The point, though, is that lots of other things could be affecting B also. B could be affected by a whole bunch of other things. Correct? But in your model, you simplify. You focus only on the relationship between A and B. You keep these other effects out of it. Right? So that is your model, is a simplified version of reality. A model is a simplified version of reality because you want to focus on your question at hand. Right? So you keep out all the other influences. You try to control for them in some way. Okay? Now this model building, well, this leads to what's called a theory very often. So what are the steps here then? Your hypothesis has become a theory. You now have a formal model. And the next step is testing the theory. The theory must be tested. In other words, you have to check the theory against facts. And there are a number of different ways that economists proceed here in that last step, testing the theory. Three ways: natural experiments, statistical investigations, and economic experiments. What's a natural experiment? Now, it's not easy for economists or other social scientists to actually conduct experiments in the way that biologists conduct experiments. And what's the reason for that? Why can't economists conduct the same kind of experiments that biologists conduct? So, no, because our subjects are human. That's what's critical. Our subjects are human. And well, if Hitler is on the wall, we might be able to do that. But you see, we can't experiment with humans. So we need natural experiments. Right? What's a natural experiment? Now here's an example. A situation that arises in the ordinary course of economic life in which the one factor of interest is different and other things are equal. For example, to test whether a higher minimum wage leads to higher unemployment. The unemployment rates of otherwise similar states with different minimum wages might be compared. Right? So let's say we have Texas and we have Oklahoma. And I'll just make this up. Let's say the minimum wage is higher in Texas than in Oklahoma. And the hypothesis here is that a higher minimum wage leads to higher unemployment because firms are unable to hire workers at that higher wage. Okay? And so what you could do in this case is compare the unemployment rate of Texas with the unemployment rate of Oklahoma. That's a natural experiment. That makes sense? Next, we have statistical investigations, and this really is the most common way of doing things. So this involves collecting survey data. So economists go about asking people questions, getting their answers, and collecting this data and then analyzing this data using statistics. So instead of getting our data from experiments, which is what biology does, a biologist runs the experiments and then collects data that comes out of those experiments. Right? Economists and other social scientists, on the other hand, because it's difficult for us to conduct experiments, we get our data from conducting surveys. Yes? However, economic experiments are now coming into their own. Right? There is a branch of economics called experimental economics. And so this is a growing field. It's still very small, but growing. And so, in a sense, data is now coming out of economic experiments. Now, what do these economic experiments consist of? You don't have laboratories. Typically, what these guys do is, economists, they have usually students like yourself play games with each other using a certain special program on computer, right? And you have these games being played, and these games then give out the output that the data that these comes. Right? For instance, let's say the question is, are females more intrinsically honest than the male? Let's say this is a question that's of interest. By the way, it is a question of interest because there are economists who argue that if you put women politicians in power, then corruption will reduce. This is an idea that's been gaining ground. And it's a very important question, isn't it? Important idea. Because there are countries out there that have a lot of corruption. And so if women could be brought into power, corruption would reduce. It's a hypothesis. How does an experimental economist set about figuring this out? I think it has this, usually these guys work with principles of economics too. Right? So they have these students play such games, and the game may involve some information being given to one party, but the person has the ability to cheat. Do you follow me? So the game is set in such a way that that a party is able to cheat to gain points, to win in the game. Right? So you pit a girl against a boy, and you give both the opportunity to cheat. And you, the economist, you observe the amount of cheating going on. Correct? And you try to figure out then whether girls cheat less. And well, a lot of these experiments have actually shown that didn't show girls cheat just as badly as much. I think there was one experiment we found, and the only exception was Orthodox Jewish girl or something. If you're highly religious female, you may not cheat. That's what came out of this. Okay. And in the last minute that I have here, well, I'm pretty much done, I think, with this chapter. So in the last minute, just give me a minute, how do these statistical investigations work? Well, that's a diagram of something that makes that point. Here you have a hypothesis that schooling increases learning. A no-brainer there, correct? More years of schooling means more learning. How do you go about testing this? You would ask people questions. Using a survey, you would ask somebody about how many years of schooling do you have? Write the answer down. How much do you earn? Write the answer down. And so for every person, you have a point in this graph. Every dot on that graph is an individual. Am I making sense? You have schooling and you have earnings. If you plot all your data points, all your individuals in this graph, you should end up with something that looks like that. A scatter diagram that indicates that there is, in fact, a positive relationship between years of schooling and earnings. So this is how statistical investigations are conducted. And with that, we are at the end of chapter 1.